Get my 6. Okay guys, we're multitasking today. You see how hard my job is? Good gosh. What a beautiful view back here, isn't it? My beautiful bride Dearly, aka Giggly Girl, and I are at one of our favorite catfishing spots here in Central Virginia. The name of the location of which will be withheld because we don't want it to become everybody else's favorite catfishing spot also. Dearly's caught 2 fish so far. I've caught 1. I caught a bluegill, she caught a bluegill, and she caught a blue cat about this big so far. So, I brought a copy of October Nights Part 2 with me so we can do today's reading with this beautiful backdrop for this beautiful October afternoon, October night by the time the video premieres. Look at the reflection of those beautiful leaves off the water. They look like trees themselves. So, interestingly, today's story is centered with the water backdrop, but not a beautiful, beautiful lake in Central Virginia, but it goes back to the Bay of Davao, which flows into the Pacific there in southern Philippines as the setting for today's story. Something we talk about regularly here on the channel is the idea of empathy, empaths, and premonitions and ghosts. This story kind of pertains to all 3 of those things. It's a story called Winthrop. It's a little longer than some of the stories you've heard so far. So I'm going to do my best to read the story and not miss the big one. I've been in the Philippines for far too long, years, but I had no way out. I was broke. It would be another 3 years before I would be able to afford to leave, and well, the newness and the fun of it all, every day being summer, year-round, so many of the lovely women love you if you're an American and you have lots of money, and all that jazz, had all worn off by this point and given way to misery. You see, when you're new in the Philippines and you have plenty of money and you're dumb enough to believe that you're as good-looking, smart, and fill in the blank with all kinds of other flattering compliments the locals give you upon sight of you, life in the Philippines as a white foreigner is great. But when you run out of money, well, you're not so good looking, smart, and etc. anymore. People avoid you, other than to harass you for their entertainment at your expense, and, well, that's a story for another time. Go read my novel, Isle of Capri, available on Amazon in print and Kindle, to find out what it's really like living in the Philippines when you're a broke-ass white guy. You can get Isle of Capri with an autograph from our Etsy store. That link's in the description box below as well. If you want to talk about a real life stuff I cannot say on social media is in that book. All right. At the time of this story's reference, stopping by to see Pizza the Hut and the boys was pretty much all I had to do, because a couple of cold ones, usually billed to a tab that got paid off once a month when my VA money came in, and a slice of pizza, if a few other guys were willing to go in with me to buy a pie, was all I could afford by then. You see, there was this batshit crazy Vietnam veteran named Eric who owned a small drinking hole on the beach at the edge of the village we lived in at the time. A year or so before this, he'd built a baking oven out of stone so that he could bake pizza. It turned out his pizza was so good, any white foreigners living as expats on that part of the island would come for pizza, the Hut's Pizza. It didn't hurt old Hut that this was also the only place you could get pizza within a 6 hours drive. Oh, and the reason we called Eric Pizza the Hut was because he was 6 feet, 8 inches tall and weighed about 320 pounds. And he was not fat. Who's that guy? Oh my. Whoa, I think we got the big one. The story will have to wait. Oh gosh, honey, I got a big one. Honey, it about pulled my pole in the water because I was reading the story.
Okay, I'm coming.
Okay. Guys, we might have to finish this story later from home. The fish are just biting too good today. Oh my gosh. He saw you, honey, and he ran, but that's okay.
Wow, that's big.
Can you see it?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
It's big.
Oh my gosh, he's taking line out.
Oh, I see it.
Is it big?
Yep, it's big. I think you need to stand
I'm gonna have
up.
to stand up. I was trying to get it all on film, but
Yeah, I will.
well, I got my camera running.
Yeah, I know. I'm gonna making it sure. Okay.
He's got me round up around these sticks.
Stick, yeah.
Oh man, he's trying to go again.
Yeah, he's a. Oh, I see it. Oh my goodness, he's smart.
Yeah, he got me wrapped around those sticks.
Yeah.
See, oh my gosh, he's
Oh,
big.
it's huge. Wow, that's huge.
I might have to get my foot wet to get him.
I think you just pull it, honey. The stick will come in.
Oh, I got him off the stick.
Okay, yeah, don't get wet.
Oh, he's a big one.
Yep, it's big. See that? That's super huge. Whoa.
Well, this was an interruption to our story, but man, look at that.
Gosh,
sucker.
honey, you got the...
This is bigger
Guys,
than yours,
hello. I cut first, big too, but I think this one is the biggest.
huh? Yeah, this is the biggest
Yeah.
one so far, huh? Honey, it's so hard to work and fish at the same time. I can't get any work done because the fish are biting so good. All right. Huh. Well, I got to pick one or the other. I can't read a story and catfish at the same time without the threat of losing my really nice Shakespeare ugly stick catfishing pole there. You saw that one almost pulled it into the water. Big one, threw it back like we do almost all of our fish unless we're camping and my wife doesn't bring food for dinner and we have to keep them to eat them. Man. Okay, so I found a spot. Let's continue with the story. I want to continue to give you this backdrop, so I'm just going to take a break from fishing for now. Get the chair out of the way. I'm going to finish the story, but what a beautiful view. Full of fish. So back to Winthrop. All right, so I'm down and out in the Philippines, hanging out at Pizza the Hut's place. And you're going to hear more about this guy, this place. More events take place here. These are true events that happen, some of the weirdest stuff that I've ever experienced in my life. So we're back there, we're eating pizza with this big guy, Eric, Pizza the Hut. Who's that guy? I asked on one particularly hot afternoon, though all afternoons in the Philippines are particularly hot. I noticed a white man, about 70 years old, sitting on the other side of the bar, all by himself. That's Charles, one of my drinking buddies for the day, Big Steve told me. Steve was an Englishman, and though not as big as Eric, he was still quite sizable. If he had sold tires, me and the boys may have referred to him as the Michelin Man, nicknamers that we were. But he didn't, so we didn't, and it's probably good that we didn't because I learned pretty early on that Big Steve liked to fight when he got drunk. And he got drunk every day, like the rest of us. And it mattered not if you were his friend or not. We decided it best not to pick a nickname for Big Steve other than the big part, which he found flattering, in case he didn't like it, or at least decided after a few drinks that he didn't like it. He's a freaking son of a whore, I'll tell you, Big Steve said, speaking of Charles. Yanks like him's why the rest of the world think you Americans are all crazy. What's his deal, I asked, taking another gulp from my bottle of San Miguel Light, the Philippines version of Bud Light, not sponsored. Just a lot stronger, both in alcohol and flavor. Okay, so it's really nothing like Bud Light, not sponsored, because it's way better. But when one is down and out in the Philippines with no foreseeable way home, one can fantasize about cheap domestic light beers. He's a freak, said one of the other expats hanging out with us. I can't remember which one, so I can't give you any nicknames or reasons why this nickname came to be. He's gay, and he's only married his poor wife so he could have a sponsor here, this nameless and now, all these years later, faceless expat said. He was referencing the fact that every time you renewed your visa at immigration in the Philippines, you had to list a sponsor, a Filipino citizen with whom you were staying, if you were staying longer than the typical 30 days that tourist visas allow. Back then it was actually 21 days. I heard his wife goes out on the street and gets ladyboys for him on his birthday, Big Steve said, referencing what might be known as cross-dressers in the West. They're known as ladyboys throughout Asia, and let me tell you, some of them are more beautiful than most women. One learns quickly to look for Adam's apples and calloused hands when spoken to by a beautiful young damsel on the streets in Asia, if one knows what's best for him. Many of these beautiful young damsels are not damsels at all. So what? I said to my beer-drinking and pizza-eating companions. We'd been able to pitch in on a pizza that day, and we were grateful because let me tell you, Pizza the Hut was as down and out in the Philippines as the rest of us were at the time, and he never cut us any discounts on his pizza, nor did he allow us to float one on our tabs. Just the beer, because he was able to float that on the tab with his vendor. We're all crazy in our own way, I said. We wouldn't be stuck over here with no way home if we weren't. Let me tell you how important I was back in my country, some expat who wasn't Big Steve or the other guy I can't remember said. I was... ... You can't see that, so I have to say that. Got an audience on the other side of the pond. That's great. I tuned this guy out and began making my way across the bar to introduce myself to Charles. About halfway over, I glanced over at the table where all our girlfriends and wives were hanging out, just as my male friends and I always bitched about the cultural differences of dating a Filipina in the Philippines. All the Filipino ladies were bitching amongst themselves about all the headaches caused by the cultural differences of living with a white foreigner in the Philippines. But hey, they all looked at me and smiled and waved and looked as pretty as they could be when I walked by, so that was okay. Yeah, we've got watchers, but it's not Bigfoot Sasquatch. It's people wondering why the hell I'm sitting in the middle of the woods reading a book. I noticed a new girl at the table, and I assumed it was Charles's wife. And I'd later find out that I was right. Her name was Ming. Yes, just like the dynasty. But remember, this story is taking place in the Philippines, not China, and Ming was a Filipino lady, not a Chinese woman. Hi, I said to Charles, having reached my destination. I'm Kevin. I'm from the U.S. I'm Charles, he said. I hadn't noticed while walking over, but apparently another man had joined Charles. He was a Filipino man in his late 20s. He wore sunglasses with really large lenses, and he wore a bright chartreuse scarf of some sort around his neck. I'm also from the U.S., Charles said, but he didn't tell me where, and he made no effort to introduce me to his friend. Where in the U.S., I asked, seeing that he was not going to volunteer this information. Charles stared at me, expressionless, and after what must have been 5 seconds but felt longer, he said, all over. How long have you been over here? I asked next. How long have you been here? He asked, without answering my question. This man was obviously self-trained in small talk bullshit avoidance. About 2 years, I said. Ah, Charles said. Just long enough to figure out things ain't quite what they seem, he said. He was starting to remind me a bit of Hannibal Lecter without the British accent. Exactly, I said. I'd noticed he'd used the word ain't, but he did so with no Southern or Appalachian accent, so I was still at a loss as to what part of the U.S. he might have been from. What kind of work do you do? Charles asked. I'm a writer, I said. Ah, Charles said, sounding just as he had when he'd said before. I could tell you so many amazing stories, he then said. I could just tell you story after story, and you could just type them all out, and we could fill a library. Sounds like fun, I said. But I've got enough of my own stories. No disrespect, but I'd love to hang out and have a beer or 10 sometime and just talk, though. That would be pleasant, Charles said. And then he pulled out a cigarette and lit it and turned away from me to stare out over the beach and the ocean. And something in my gut told me that I'd just been dismissed. I told Charles it had been a pleasure meeting him and that I'd see him around. He didn't respond. He appeared to be, perhaps, a bit depressed. I know my fellow expat buddies might have used other words to describe what I was seeing, words like weird or even arrogant, but I got the deep sense that something was wrong with Charles. It's as if I could somehow sense his emotions. I left post-haste because I also felt strangely as if I were absorbing his emotions and I was becoming very uncomfortable. Yeah, I keep getting my 6. Had a couple dinks over there wondering what the hell I was doing. I guess they moved on. Okay. Another month of each day feeling like the one before it, the middle of summer, even though I knew we were well into the month of October. Love that month. Passed. That's the thing about living in a place that doesn't have seasons. Each day seems like the one before, and you completely lose track of time. Not the time of day, but the time of year. Nothing, having come from the mid-Atlantic in the U.S., where 4 seasons are prevalent, can make time stand still like moving to a place where there are no changing seasons. I'd not seen Charles since that first day I'd met him, and honestly, I can't say I even thought of him. However, on this day, a month after having met him, I saw Ming again hanging out with the women folk at Pizza the Huts. "Where's that Charles guy?" asked my buddies, as we all fumbled with the change and bills in our pockets, trying to see if we had enough money for a pizza. Hut was in the back trying to figure out if he even had enough ingredients to make one. "Fucker's suffering from a bad case of agoraphobia," Big Steve said. "That sucks," I said, knowing all too well what Big Steve was talking about. This was common among the expats who'd been in the Philippines long enough to really figure it out. Life in the Philippines as a white foreigner, having, of course, run out of money in order to learn the lesson. There would simply be times when you did not want to go outside to be harassed by the locals because you were white, or because your nose was too long, or because your arms and legs were so hairy. Pick any difference between white Westerners and South Pacific Islanders, and they'll make fun of you and harass you for it if you're not anteing up and buying them beer or food, or just outright giving them money for no reason at all. Sadly, some of those agoraphobic episodes can last weeks and even months. "I heard he's got himself shut up in his bedroom and he won't even come out," the nameless expat from before, who was sitting with us again, said. "His wife's family has moved in and taken over the whole house." "Should we go see him?" I asked. "Maybe try to nudge him out?" "Fuck no," Big Steve said. "He'll probably try to put the move on us, mate. I'm telling you, the man's as queer as they come." We had just enough for pizza, but Pizza the Hut only had enough dough and sauce. We took it anyway, and we ate like gods, fantasizing what it would be like with just a bit of cheese and perhaps a slice or two of pepperoni. And no, Pizza the Hut didn't give us a discount for the lack of toppings. At times, he truly was what Big Steve would refer to as a son of a whore. Another week passed, and I was back at Pizza the Hut's place, and Ming was there, and she approached me. "You are the writer," she said. It sounded like a statement, but I'd been in the Philippines long enough to know it was a question. "Yes," I said. "Charles has story for you to write," Ming said. One thing I really do appreciate about Filipino culture is that they get right to the point. They don't waste your time. Well, unless you still have money. They'll take the time to butter you up in that event, because the more they butter you up, they figure the more of your money they'll get, and it's usually the case. But Ming already knew that me and my boys at Hut's place were all broke asses, so it was her time that she didn't want to waste. "Sorry," I said. "I'm actually in the middle of a novel I'm hoping will do well enough to get me out of this place." I was halfway through writing Isle of Capri, and it would not garner enough revenues and sales to get me out of the Philippines. I finished writing it on what I thought at the time to be my deathbed, while I was in the hospital suffering from dengue fever on top of bronchitis. This, of course, would be about 6 months after the events of this story, and after I received a special pen crafted from an odd piece of coconut wood from a very peculiar coconut tree from a very special woman on top of a really creepy mountain in the deep, dark jungles of Mindanao. But that's a story for another time. Oh, wait until you hear that one. And it's coming. It's in this book. "Charles very sick," Ming said. "No time left. He says you'll like it because it's a ghost story." My ears perked up a bit at the words ghost and story, but still, I had no desire to sit and type out a story someone else was telling, because that was not, as I viewed it, being a writer. That, as I viewed it, was being a secretary. I politely declined again, and Ming finally took my no for an answer, and without saying goodbye, for that would have been a waste of her time, she went back over to the women folk. She wasn't being rude and not saying goodbye, she was just following her culture. Small talk doesn't exist in the Philippines, nor does pointless niceties, and as hard as that was to adjust to at first, I came to like and appreciate it. How many times, I thought, had I been engaged in meaningless conversation with folks back in the U.S., And how much time had I wasted, and what productively could I have been doing differently with that time? That is one part of Filipino culture I am proud to have brought home with me. I do not engage in idle small talk with anyone. My time is too valuable and my peace of mind too precious. Gosh, what beautiful scenery. I love October. This is a great scenery. I was hoping to get some more fishing done, but again, I just don't want to lose the pole. They're just biting too good in here. He'll probably be dead in a fortnight, I overheard Big Steve telling a nicknameless and faceless expat a week or so later at Hut's place. It was the first of the month, so I actually had some VA money. I was planning on paying off my tab and buying the boys around and treating them all to a pizza. No wonder I was usually broke. Sadly, Pizza the Hut had been waiting on my money to go buy ingredients, so we couldn't enjoy a pizza that day, though we did the next day. So I treated the guys to a couple of rounds. In their defense, they always did the same when their money came in monthly as well. We viewed it as if we were all in this down and out in the Philippines thing together. Who'll be dead in a fortnight? I asked Big Steve, pulling out a stool and bellying up to the bar. Charles, Big Steve said. The AIDS has finally got hold of him good. It's not AIDS, the nicknameless and faceless expat sitting with Steve said. I heard it's some disease that can't be identified. No one knows what it is. He was given 6 months to live, so he came here to die in the sun. He's been here for 6 years, Big Steve said, the look on his face letting us know he clearly wasn't buying it. Maybe there's something to the benefits of the sand and the sun, the other guy said, and getting away from the stress of Western living. Man, I just get stressed out when the fish are biting so bad I can't be fishing for them because I got to do my job. Ming was there again that day, and after a few beers, I decided to go over and let her know I'd like to take Charles up on his offer. I really started feeling like a self-centered son of a whore, my lack of willingness to go hear an old guy who really was on his deathbed out. I figured I could flatter him in his final hours by click-clacking away on my laptop while he told a few of his stories. Ming told me how to get to their house, and the next day I was there relatively early, laptop in tow, but I did not type at all that day. Charles and Ming had a fine home. They'd built it just a few years before, with Charles's U.S. dollars, of course. The property was fenced and gated, and there was a paid guard at the gate. None of this, of course, was uncommon, as there was generally a litany of terrorists, criminals, and communist group members on the lookout for white foreigners to kidnap for ransom. We were living in Mindanao. The guard let me into the compound, and Ming met me at the door and welcomed me into their home. The guys at the bar were right. Her family had obviously taken over. There were little Filipino children running around everywhere. There were adults from 3 generations inside. This is how most people outside of Western culture live. None of that get out when you're 18 crap. The older generation watches the youngest generation while the middle generation works for a living. Unless, of course, there's a white foreigner in the picture, as was the case with Charles. No, in that case, everyone just moves in and no one from any generation works because, well, we white foreigners are all so filthy rich. At least that's what far too many of the locals think, because let me tell you, in the cases of me and the boys down at Pizza the Hut's place, we were not. Ming took me upstairs and pointed to a closed door and said, "There." And then she went back downstairs, screaming at some kid that she was going to beat them within an inch of their lives if they didn't stop doing whatever it was they were doing. The kid stopped immediately, because you see, that's the thing about Filipino mothers. They don't waste time threatening to count to 3 while only making it to 2.5, then counting from there in 30 seconds. They beat that ass off the first time, and the kid listens from that point on. I knocked on the door and was told by Charles on the other side to come in, so I did. When I opened the door, I was hit by a blinding beam of sunlight. Once my eyes adjusted, I realized Charles was no idiot. While building this house, he knew exactly what would happen, as far as the family coming down from all the mountains to move in, completely uninvited, so he'd been preemptive with his defense. He'd built a suite for himself and Ming. There was a double sliding glass door that led out to a second-story veranda that had a pool. I saw Charles's Filipino friend, the gentleman who'd been with him at the bar when I'd first met him outside on the veranda. He was wearing only a pair of shorts and that lime green scarf of his, soaking up the sun. I gave him a head nod, but he didn't return my greeting. It was as if he hadn't seen me, but again, I wrote it all off to culture, i.e. all that lack of small talk stuff I've already written about, or told you about here in this reading. "Thanks for coming by," Charles said. "You're welcome," I said. I heard you were not well. How are you? Not well, he said. You heard correctly. I don't want to be inappropriate, I said, but I'm curious. What ails you? You've no doubt heard I have AIDS, Charles said, or cancer, or some mysterious disease that is yet to be identified. I've heard all those things, I said. None of them are correct, Charles said. I didn't say anything. I figured if Charles wanted me to know what was wrong with him, he'd tell me. And in short order, he did. Kevin, he began, I'm dying of a broken heart. Oh, I said, and the word came out like a question. I'd learned years ago you can do a lot with the word oh, all depending on the inflection you put on it. Basically, the proper inflection on such a small word can keep someone talking forever or shut them up immediately. My soulmate is dead, Charles said, and my heart longs to join him. Oh, I said again, sticking with my tactic. You've no doubt heard that I'm gay, Kevin, and now that I've admitted my soulmate was a he rather than a she, you no doubt feel as if what you've heard is correct. I don't judge, I said, and it was the truth. No need to, Kevin, because it's not true. I'm not gay. Never have been. Oh, I said, but this time it had nothing to do with strategy. It's because I was confused. You're no doubt confused by all this now, Kevin, aren't you? I am, I told him. It was like he was reading my mind, like you, dear reader, are reading these words, or listening to them read to you. My soulmate's name was Winthrop, Charles said. We met only a year ago on a crowded street in Manila. There was an immediate bond, and I knew I wanted to spend as much time with Winthrop as I could. My wife actually agreed on moving him in, and I look back now knowing I made the right decision, because now that he's gone, I know that at least I spent the last months of his life with him, daily, since we'd allowed him to move in. I didn't say oh at all this time. I knew not the proper inflection to place on the word, so I remained silent. There's something quite unique that drew me to Winthrop, and at the same time has drawn me to you, Kevin. It's why I asked you to come here when we first met. Though I could tell you stories enough to fill a library, I have no intention of doing so. I don't mind, I said. I'm sure you don't, Charles said. I'm sure you've calculated the time. You wouldn't have to type long before you were able to stop due to my worldly expiration. I'd rather, frankly, just spend our time together talking and getting to know each other a bit. You see, Kevin, you and I, as Winthrop did as well, possess what can be considered either a gift or a curse. And it's what drew me to you as it drew me to Winthrop, this gift/curse. And what is this gift/curse you speak of, I asked, confused as hell. We, Kevin, as was Winthrop, are empaths. This is the blessing/curse I speak of, and it is this I'd like to focus on during our time together. I can assure you, however, that if you pay very close attention, you'll get your ghost story by the time we're through. What is an empath, I asked, and what's it have to do with ghosts? All in good time, Kevin, all in good time. With this, he rolled slightly to one side and then said, but it will have to wait until tomorrow. For now, I need a bit of rest. Okay, I said, and I rose, and I told him I'd stop back by tomorrow if it was okay, and he said it was. And on my way to leave, I looked out the sliding glass door to wave goodbye to the Filipino man I'd seen on the veranda, wearing only swimming trunks and that bright green chartreuse scarf. But he was gone. I hadn't seen him enter the room while I'd been talking to Charles, so I assumed there was a set of stairs outside and he'd simply gone down them so as not to disturb Charles and me. A couple of days passed before I made it back to see Charles. I'd told my girlfriend, now my wife, Dearly, who you saw earlier, who came over when I caught that big giant fish and who's fishing right on the other side of the phone. I told Dearly about my experience. Charles speaking in riddles, mumbo jumbo I couldn't really understand, etc. At the time, she'd not been to the U.S. yet, and frankly, she wrote the majority of white foreigners off as being crazy like most of her countrymen did, and she told me simply to be careful when I was around Charles. When I did go back to see Charles, he told me more about his soulmate, Winthrop. He said he and his wife, Ming, had flown to Manila to pick up her brother, Young, who'd been in Manila, some work-related stuff or something, and bring him back to Mindanao. It was there, Charles said, on the excessively overcrowded streets of this nation's capital, that I first laid eyes on Winthrop. I could feel him even before I saw him. He radiated beauty. As Ming and I made our way through the mass of humanity on the streets of Manila and closer to Winthrop, I became so overwhelmed with the feelings his beautiful soul was giving me through the cosmos that I found myself walking down the street with an erection. It was nothing sexual, mind you. It was simply a mix of emotion and actual physical sensation like I'd rarely experienced. And once I'd met him, and as our eyes met, well, let's just say I knew he was the person I wanted to spend my time with, the rest of my time in this life and the ever after. I was still confused by all of this as I'd been when I'd come to meet with Charles the first time. I felt as if I'd earned the right to be a little more probing with my line of questioning, so I began being so. No more use of the word "oh." It was time for complete qualifying questions. Winthrop sounds like an English name to me, I said. Was Winthrop an Englishman? Not in this life, Charles said. In this life, he'd been born into the adjunct poverty of so many of the Filipino people you've no doubt seen yourself. It was 3 past lives ago when he'd been Winthrop, and yes, then he'd been not just an Englishman, but a gentleman as well, as in lord, a knighted nobleman. Okay, time to revert back to that old nut I carried around with me for times like this, so I did. Oh, I said. I know this might be difficult for you to understand, Kevin, but in time you'll understand far more of this than you're comfortable with. I've never met any other empath who's understood even a small percentage of their powers before reaching the age of 40. I'd say you're getting close. How old are you in this life? I'm 37, I told him, my age at the time. Yes, he said, you're getting close. So what exactly is an empath, I asked. Less than 1% of the human population are empaths, Kevin, he said. As empaths, we have the unique gift of really tuning into someone else's emotional state. We can do this with friends and family or complete strangers. And we don't even need to be engaged in conversation with the person. We simply need to be in their presence. Even though this was the first explanation of what an empath was that I'd ever heard up until that point in my life, I knew immediately that Charles was spot on because I'd had these strange feelings about myself and other people my whole life. The biggest, most important lesson we must learn once we understand our empathy, Kevin, is self-protection, Charles continued. If we spend too much time with negative people, we will become angry, depressed, and even vicious. It's why when I go to Eric's bar, I prefer to sit alone. I cannot stand absorbing the energy put off by people like that big oaf Steve. And frankly, if it weren't for the beer and pizza, I wouldn't be able to tolerate being in the presence of Eric. His aura is, excuse my lower socioeconomic English, fucked up. The man is simply a son of a whore. I'm kind of picking up on what you're laying down, I told Charles, and I was. But I'm not following completely. Think of yourself as a rechargeable battery on low, Charles said. We, as empaths, often recharge our batteries by absorbing other people's energy. That's why it's so important to either surround ourselves with positive, loving people or to spend time alone with no one. Because we either recharge our batteries with extended periods of time alone, with our own naturally positive energy, or we refill the battery with the energy of other people. If we're around positive go-getter types, we'll become positive until that energy is gone. If we recharge with negative energy from negative people, the inverse is true. We will be negative, grumpy assholes until that energy is gone as well. I've noticed that, I told Charles. There have been times I've been around negative assholes for just a few minutes, but then I've felt negative and grumpy myself for the next few days. I could never figure out why. I've often thought I was simply being overly sensitive to what that person might have said or done in my presence, but I know I have thick skin. I knew it had to be something else. And now you know, Charles said. How long have you understood all this, I asked. Most of my adult life, Charles said. And of course, the Good American Medical Association back home did their best to medicate it out of me. I've been here for more than 20 years, Kevin. Another thing the busybody expats at the Huts place had been wrong about. And though it's not always been a bed of roses, living the life of a white foreigner in a non-white third world country, and I've had to endure many of the ugly experiences you no doubt have yourself being here, I've not had to worry about quacks drugging my natural gift out of me and turning me into a mental mound of mush, which was the case when I was back home before expatriating here. Damn, I said, and all of a sudden I wasn't so sure that I did want to go home. Trust me, I'd been diagnosed as this and that back home myself, and any medication they'd ever put me on never seemed to make anything better. All it did was make me numb, and I myself had decided I'd rather feel bad some of the time rather than feel nothing all of the time. I shared this with Charles and asked his advice, and then he said, "Perhaps tomorrow, Kevin." And then he rolled over to one side, and I took that as my cue to go. I told Charles goodbye, and as I was leaving, I noticed his Filipino friend was not on the veranda, just as he'd not been when I'd arrived. But as soon as I opened the bedroom door to exit the room, the Filipino man in question was standing there on the other side, and as I left, he went in. "He's going to sleep," I whispered. He put one finger to his lips as if to say shh, but made no sound at all. As I was shutting the door after leaving the room, I looked back in and I saw the Filipino man now by Charles's bedside. I watched for just a second as the man took the bright chartreuse scarf off his neck and laid it over Charles's face. I had no idea what was going on, but I figured it wasn't my business, so I left, lightly shutting the door behind me. The next day, I swung by Pizza the Hut's place to see the boys before heading over to Charles's house. It was midday and I was getting a bit of a late start as well. I'd woken up with an extreme hangover, pretty common back in those days of regular heavy drinking, and with the poison of choice often being, as was the case here, Tanduay rum, which is the cheapest, most rot gut rum not worth buying anywhere on earth, unless of course you're a down and out expat in the Philippines and have to choose between food and a buzz or food and no buzz or a buzz and no food. It's a combination where Tanduay rum always wins. "You're a bit late," Big Steve told me when I let the boys know I'd stopped by to see if they had any well wishes for Charles. I'd already confirmed with them that they were right. He was near the end. "He's gone," Big Steve said. "You mean?" I said, trailing off. "Yeah," Pizza the Hut said. "Ming came by about an hour ago and let us know. They'll start the viewing this evening." In the Philippines, it is customary for the body of the deceased to be displayed in their home, open casket, for a week. Sometimes the bodies are embalmed, and sometimes they are not. I always made it a habit to go show my respects on the first day or two of someone's passing so as not to take any chances of showing up too late in the week on an unembalmed body. As such, I waited until the next day to go see Charles's body and pay my respects to Ming and his other survivors. Knowing Charles was no longer available, I figured why not have some booze with the boys. Nothing cures a hangover better than the hair of the dog that bit you. Dearly went with me the next day, and upon entering the home, she quickly sought out Ming. She sat with her and offered her condolences. I offered mine, but remained standing, and I eventually left Dearly with Ming and made my way to the casket. Charles looked the same in death, at least the day after dying, as he had when he'd been sleeping in life. I moved over to a set of tables at the foot of the casket. The tables had displayed upon them pictures of Charles and his friends and family from his years spent in the Philippines. This picture was of Ming and Charles on some beautiful white sandy beach with crystal blue waters in the background. That picture was of Charles and a couple of other foreigners hiking through the jungle. They were surrounded by coconut trees and cocoa trees. Beside that picture was a picture of Charles and his Filipino friend with the bright chartreuse scarf tied around his neck. The two of them were sitting on a boat, crossing the bay to visit a small neighboring island. I turned around and began searching the room for the man who'd been in the picture with Charles. It was time for us to meet officially, and I knew the two had been close, as I'd seen them always together, and though we'd never spoken before, I was certain that if anyone needed consoling, it was this man. Just as I turned, Ming and Dearly were approaching me. "Who is this?" I asked Ming as they drew next to me. I was pointing to the man with Charles in the picture, the man with the bright chartreuse scarf around his neck. "That is Young, Ming said. "He was my older brother." "What do you mean was?" I said. "He's still your brother, right?" I knew what Ming meant. Young was her older brother. I was merely picking on her for her broken English, something admittedly I still do with my wife, but only because I think it's adorable. It's certainly not to be mean or to make fun of her, and she knows this. "Not in this world," Ming said, "but we will be together again in another place, and Charles will be there with us." "Wait a minute," I said. "I'm confused." Ming went on to explain, clearing my confusion in one regard, but making me quite a bit more confused in another. "Charles and Young met months after Charles and I were married," Ming explained. Young was an OFW, overseas Filipino worker. He was on the shipping vessels out to sea when Charles and I met and wed. He got back months later and they met when Charles and I traveled to Manila to pick him up and bring him home. I said nothing as I knew not what to say. My knowledge of the use of the word "oh" had no application here. What happened to Young Young, I said, if you don't mind me asking. 2 months ago, Bing said, he was at the market and he stepped out into the street and was hit and killed by a jeepney. That's terrible, I said, but the emotions I felt had nothing to do with sympathy for Young Young. They were emotions that would fit somewhere between shock and terror as it dawned on me that twice in the past week and once back at Pizza the Hut's place when I'd first met Charles, when I had seen Young Young for the first time as well, in the flesh as it were, that I had actually been seeing a ghost, as the man Young Young had been dead and in his grave for the past 2 months. Charles gave him this scarf, Ming said, now touching Young Young's scarf in the picture with the end of her index finger. Charles told him a real sailor must always wear scarf, and Young Young never took it off. Is that right, I said, still struggling, trying to both process this information and not let my feelings show at the same time. Yes, Ming said. He was even buried in it. The end. It's time to get back to fishing. I have chills just remembering when that happened. Whew. See you for more next time.